Well, this is a institute that keeps with traditions, and today is the traditional time and day that we want to give as a group back to our presenters and to our organizers, and to thank them for all their efforts and for honoring us in such a tremendous way. And I'm speaking on behalf of those that have been veterans here year after year, but we also want to be inclusive and model good inclusiveness. So I'm going to also ask Grant to speak as a relative newcomer.
I just want to say thank you to everybody for making me feel so welcome. I love you guys. You guys are great. Yeah, big heart. I just want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to the people who make this such a wonderful institute. Mr. Hill, what an incredible man. He's so patient. He's so wonderful. He's younger than his years. He's incredible. I know for me personally, the best professional development experiences have always been at Stanford. I also went to a SPICE conference about 10 years ago. They are almost as good as this conference is, but they're always first-class institution. And I want to find out how to be a member for life at this place. That's how great this is. So I want to thank Mr. Hill for accepting me and letting me come. I want to thank all of the wonderful speakers that have given us an opportunity to learn from them. I'd like us all to give them a nice big round of applause. Nice job, you guys.
So after those gracious words, let me first begin with Don. What we've done is Wayne has graciously organized it and has acquired gift certificates at the restaurants that they prefer. Don?
You guys have been great. Thank you.
And Ram?
Thank you very much.
And Gavin, I'm going to ask you also to give to John, because you'll see him. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You guys are fabulous. Thank you very much. It's very, very nice of you. Please.
Because unfortunately, as is typical in most years, the one person who disappears around this time is Daphne. And we had some great comments earlier, and Jerry and I are going to give Daphne her card and her gift certificate. But we couldn't have the fabulous experience we did if it isn't for her organization, for her arranging the logistics, the food, and everything that really makes it a fabulous experience. And so, on behalf of all of us, Jerry and I will extend your appreciation to Daphne for everything that she does to make this conference possible. Jerry?
Behind a lot of great men, you always find a woman. And so, in our case, it's Daphne Baldwin. I am honored to be asked to go up and give them honor.
Yeah, it's really great. Thanks a lot, and again, we love it as much as you guys do. So this is great. I think I wanted to before I start talking about the next topic, I thought I might open. I saw I open it up to discussion and kind of hear a little bit what you guys have to say about the kind of the teacher, how valuable is a good teacher and other things. For 5 minutes, just I want to listen as well. I got interested in this, or in general. My mom is a teacher for 30 years. And she, she's been a teacher in elementary school and then was a school principal. And, she's one of these people who, view this as a mission in life. And, always say, oh, wow, this is great that they are paying me to do that because I would do it anyway. And so, it's one of these things that even when I saw this study, before they, when they were just designing it, I was talking to Raj Chet, and I said, but you're measuring teachers in a very narrow, particular way of value, just the value added. Even if you found no effect of this great teachers on outcomes, I will still not buy it. That great teachers don't have a value. I will just conclude that your measure is not able to capture the entire, the entire depth of being a fabulous teacher. But still, so look at, and that's what they find. But with, but nevertheless, they were able to find such big effects even when using a limited measure. So to me, it says, imagine how valuable it is if you could measure everything else as well. So I thought just because this is kind of close to your heart, and you know about this much more than I do, then it will be interesting to kind of spend a few minutes to discuss, to hear your thoughts. And I don't know if, let's take the microphone just so that you. All right, so good. So so here Ben will be with the microphone. You just.
I have a question. If you're looking at that graph and showing the effects of the high-quality teacher, are you also perhaps able to read it the other way, to see the effects of the very low-quality teacher?
It's a good question. I mean, I think surely they can do it. I don't remember. It's a very good point. I will talk. I will talk to to Raj and John, and we'll ask them. They for sure they can do it. They measure value-added teachers, and they kind of look at how the fabulous ones doing relative to the average. And a couple of you also came to me during the break and say, I wonder what's the effect of a terrible teacher. How much do they hurt your life? Outcomes, and it's interesting. I mean, they can probably look at it. I will pass the word for them.
So I went to a Stanford conference that wasn't related to this, but it was related to teaching. It was in the education department a couple of years ago, and one of the things they did measure was like Teach for America, and they didn't measure whether the teacher was terrible or good, but they did measure the effect of having an experienced teacher for 3 years in your elementary school grade versus having inexperienced teachers, and there was a pretty substantial, statistically significant effect.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I actually experienced something very different that I'd never experienced before in my life as a teacher. This past year, the students thanked me, and they said that they enjoyed the class, that they were so happy to have had a teacher that knew the content, and they had fun and what have you. And so that was like, that was really cool. It's like, wow, they're actually thanking me for torturing them for the year.
Show them the slides. Yes.
So,
You
Thanks. It would seem what that leads to, what the value-added return leads to, is that one of the great concerns are allocating resources effectively in a macroeconomic situation, and that perhaps one of the worst ways in which we allocate resources is extremely talented young teachers are severely underpaid as a resource, if that data is true, because their value added is great, and they are generally, because of the way salaries are paid in public schools, let me even be more specific, young, talented public school teachers are paid the least. And therefore,
blonde hair, no?
and therefore get the worst. It seemed to be a very inefficient way of attracting talent into a very significant value-added field.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is it's a very good point. And in fact, when I told you, you remember, when I said, you can't really take use the value added to kind of evaluate teachers only based on it, because, teaching is much more than that. But it's definitely could be an input in evaluating teachers. And so at some level, if you believe and again, we think it's a pretty good measure that captures something real. And there is there could be evaluations based on how much value you add. And the seller, and just like in many other professions, tie the, your salary, your earnings, your benefits to your performance in some ways, and and in a way that we can, that is kind of also measurable. So I mean, it's a point I'll take. And so I think I will. Sorry, Chris. The last question, and then I will.
One of the, as you were talking about the external benefits to education, one of the big debates lately has been on early childhood education and on the societal benefits there. And some of I think that all of what you said was very good, but in fact perhaps understated the benefits
Yeah.
from a macroeconomic and societal perspective. Specifically, some of the kinds of benefits that they talk about with early childhood education, which are surely true at the secondary level and the primary level, especially in developing countries, are things like freeing up parental resources so that people can return to the labor force instead of watching the kids at home. And essentially babysitting. I mean, it's essentially, even if, sort of like you said with the MBAs, if you think about an MBA program as babysitting a 25-year-old.
I did mean that, by the way, just for the record.
But even if primary education doesn't provide a huge amount of cognitive improvement for kids, there is, as I think we can all relate to in the summertime when our kids are home, it affects your labor supply decision when your kids are at home as opposed to when they're being taken care of at school.
It's very well taken. I also, it brings me to this other point that I didn't give, so this was, I didn't give, this, don't think about this as a comprehensive talk about, economics of education. Economics of education is a much richer and kind of more insightful field than I just described here in kind of this couple of hours. I really was just, I'm just focusing on some aspects of it. There are many other aspects of it, some of which actually have a lot of research and, evaluating based on performance, the effect of education on the economy as a whole, the intersection between labor market participation and education, many fascinating things going on in this field of economics of education. This is just kind of like a, I focus on one particular aspect just and kind of expand it, but I will be happy to also give you more resources if you're interested about other reading in the economics of education, because it's a field that has been, it's a very exciting field recently. So I think that, so if I think about the first part of the talk as, what are the returns to education? We talked about, there are monetary returns, non-monetary returns, it's, costs, benefits, and so on. One natural question to ask is, okay, so you highlight the returns to education so much, but do students actually respond to the returns to education? Like, do they take school more seriously when they think that the returns to education increase? Do they go to college more often when they think the premium of going to college is higher, or when they think they will have all these other benefits from going to college? Do students actually respond like the economic theory will expect them from changes in the returns to education? And so, if you thought it was interesting so far, I'm going to bring it down a little bit by discussing my own research and, try to get at some of that. So, so this is I'm going to describe to you a paper, with Victor Lavi from the Hebrew University that is trying to tackle, this question in a particular setting, and ask the question of how responsive is schooling to the returns to education. And again, noticing that although this is a key implication of economic theory, we talk so much about economic returns, it's a key implication that when the returns to schooling are higher, we expect students to study more. Does it really hold water? Does the data show that students take school more seriously when this is the case? It's been challenging to empirically test, and there is some work on it, which I will not have enough time to cover, but it has been challenging to empirically test whether schooling responds to return, both because, variation across individuals, measuring how different the returns to education across individuals is very hard, but also because usually we don't have sharp changes in the rate of return to education. So yes, there is gradually over the 1980s and 90s and 2000, the premium, increase, but there are many other things that happen. So we rarely have settings where there is a sharp increase from one, from one year to the other in the returns to education. Then we can test whether students respond to that. And so what we are going to do is we are going to try to address this challenge in this very specific setting and this unusual episode of sharp changes in the returns to education in the Israeli kibbutzim. And I don't know, many of you are return customers here. So you have seen me talking a couple of years ago about the kibbutzim. How many of you, by the way, were in my talk on kibbutzim a couple of years ago? So maybe, yeah, more than half. So, and so Israeli kibbutzim are these communities in Israel that were based for decades on full equal sharing of resources and no private ownership of property. So kind of a socialist communities where, and basically, you know, monetary returns to education in such a setting is very, very low. If you're a high school dropout or you have a degree in computer science, you get paid the same in the community. There are no monetary returns to education. And so after decades of wages being set in a way that is like this, independent on your human capital, the kibbutzim reformed their communities and introduced these market wages. Now if you earn more than a certain amount, you get to keep some of it and only the rest you share with the community. So basically here is a setting, again, you know, like it's a small setting, but one that allows us to study what happens when the returns to education increase suddenly. Do high school students take school more seriously? Do they learn more? What, you know, like, and kind of like, you know, extrapolating from this will be challenging. You know, there is the question of, we talked about the other, you know, internal validity versus external validity. Will it apply to other places or not? But it's kind of a place to start. And if you think that people respond to incentives in particular ways, and they do it across settings, then maybe we can learn something from this to the broader question. And so while very tempting, I'm not going to kind of talk about a lot about kibbutzim and how fascinating they are. And this is really just one aspect of why they are so fascinating. And I've devoted the last decade to study many other dimensions of them. I will kind of start with kind of just showing them for the purpose of does schooling respond to changes in returns to education, and then if we have time towards the end of the talk, which is like in 30 minutes though, I just noticed, 12, right? We go to 12. Then I will spend a few minutes talking about maybe the kibbutzim more generally, you know, but if not, again, we can continue next year, you know, like so what we do, so this changes, so basically, this shift of the kibbutz away from equal sharing sharply increased the returns to schooling. So this is data from a couple of kibbutzim that I actually had data on every single person in that kibbutz. And you could see the blue line is before this reform. I call it the pay reform that increased the return to education. You see that, you know, people of all levels of education were getting paid the same. And then after the reform, where they introduced, you know, shifted away from equal sharing, now you see the usual, you know, people with college degree earn more than high school, people with high school education, people with MA and PhD, they earn more than college educated. And so we are thinking from this perspective of a sharp increase in the return to education. Do high school students in the kibbutzim take school more seriously once there is this pay reform? Okay? And so what we do, and so by the way, this is, you know, we talk about the, you know, so we talk about this from the point of view of economics of education. There is another perspective that I just want to put out there, it's a little aside, of another way to view changes like this in the returns to education is from the public economic view. So there is a literature about like how educational responses of redistributive policies, so when the tax rate changes, you know, like what happens in the market, you know, like when people work harder and so on. And so there is a large literature on how changes in the income taxes affect the labor supply in the short run. But we know less about how tax changes will affect the long run labor supply because we don't know, because maybe the tax changes today will have these educational responses today, which will affect the labor market tomorrow. And so that's kind of like this pay reform, one way to view it, is a sharp decline in the income tax rate from 100%, where everybody is getting paid the same, to a more you know, gradual, usual income tax rate. And so in this sense, we estimate these educational responses to tax changes. Okay, so I want to say a word on the methodology here, just because it came out it came up a few times during this week that people use this differences in differences methodology, and I felt it might be a good time to kind of like give you a sense of what it means and why economists, applied economists tend to use it. So just a slide on that. So the differences in differences technique is an econometric technique that basically tries to mimic experimental design when we don't have an experiment, when we actually use observational data. It is an attempt to overcome or alleviate this selection bias that, but people who acquire education, they are different than those who don't, and if you don't take this into account, how do I know that it's causal effect? Everything we discussed so far. The difference in difference estimator, basically what it does is identifying two groups, basically. Maybe in my setting it would be kibbutzim that performed, and kibbutzim that didn't perform yet. And looking at one of them as a control group to the other. And ask the question, let's compare the average change over time in the outcome for the treatment group to the average change over time in the control group. So the underlying idea is, maybe you will show that education increases. But maybe education would have increased over that period of time, even if you didn't do any reform. Well, if I have experimental evidence, that's great. I can just randomize the reform to some and not to others, and then that solves that problem. But, many questions in life, we don't have a randomized experiment. So what we do is we try to identify a group that was not supposed to be affected by the reform, and then to compare differences between these two groups and attribute changes in the outcomes to the treatment, if you want, to the reform. So I hope this is somewhat clear. I mean, I can spend more time on this, and then it's important to realize that this difference in difference estimators, they can be interpreted as the causal effect rather than just correlation, under the assumption that in the absence of the treatment, the change in outcome would not have been systematically different between the treatment and control group. So basically, if you compare a reform, reform versus ones who didn't perform, you kind of assume that in the absence of the reform, the two groups would have advanced similar in the outcome. And if you are willing to believe that, then you can interpret this as more than a correlation, more causal estimator. So this is just a word on the end. It's a very widespread now in applied microeconomics. So I thought it's worth to say a word about this. But yeah. So what we do in a nutshell, our research design is we ask the question, is the increase in high school achievement? So we have data on high school students in this kibbutzim. We know when this kibbutzim reformed and introduced this pay reform that increased the returns to education. We ask, is the increase in the high school achievement following the reform larger for students in kibbutzim that reformed early versus those who reformed late? So basically the approach is something like that. Imagine, this is the timeline. So some kibbutzim basically introduced this pay reform in 1998 and 99. Others waited and reformed in 2003 and 2004. Some kibbutzim actually didn't reform at all, but I have plenty of research that show that those kibbutzim who didn't reform are very different animal than the ones who did reform. Many things, were different in them relative to the ones who did reform. So it's kind of a little bit comparing oranges to apples. If I compare kibbutzim that did reform versus the ones who didn't. It's more appealing to compare kibbutzim that eventually reformed, but they just did so in different times. And I'll talk more about this. And so then we look at cohorts, just give me 1 second. Then what we do is we look at cohorts of students who were in high school just before any reform happened, and then cohorts of students who were in high school after the reform happened, but before it happened in those kibbutzim that reformed very late. So then we have a treatment group, if you want, kibbutzim that reformed early. We look at students who were affected by this reform, and we compare them to ones whose kibbutz didn't yet reform, and they were under full equal sharing the whole time. Is it the case that students in kibbutzim that reform early, will they take school more seriously once the kibbutz increase the return to education? That's the question. And so what we do, and so it requires a lot of data. What we do is we use administrative records collected by the Israeli Ministry of Education of 6 consecutive cohorts of 10th graders. Okay, so why 10th grader? Because that's the first year of high school, last year of compulsory schooling, compulsory schooling. So we look at those 10th graders. And the data is based on annual reports submitted by the school authorities to the Ministry of Education at the beginning of the school year. So each record contain information like date of birth, gender, importantly parental education, that I'm sure in this audience you will guess this is important, turns out to be important, ethnicity, number of siblings, and the home address. Because we have the home address, we know whether they live in kibbutz and what kibbutz they live in, and we then link the home address. It allows us to identify individuals who live in the kibbutz, which we link to the date of when the kibbutz reformed. Okay, that's what we do. And so we then link the students' files with administrative records on schooling outcomes. And what we do is we focus on the following outcomes. So maybe I have 18 minutes. I don't know how much I should, maybe I'll give you, just because, for this audience it must be interesting, I think, is a word on the Israeli school system, which is different than the US high school system. The high school students in Israel are enrolled in either academic track leading to matriculation certificate, which we call the Bagrut, or an alternative track that leads only to high school diploma. It's kind of like more similar to the German and French system than it is to the US system. And so matriculation certificate is like a key milestone in the education career of a high school dude. It's a prerequisite for university admission, and it is completed by passing a series of national exams in core and elective subjects between 10th and 12th grade. And it varies in proficiency. You can take like 5 units of math if you want to take a really harder math track, or you can take 3 units if you just want to take the basics. Similarly for English and other elective courses. And again, 10th grade is the last year of compulsory education and the first year of high school, and so we focus on 10th grader. We follow them forward and see how they do, depending on whether they faced high returns to education or low return to education when they went through high school. So basically what the outcomes we look at is, whether the student graduated at all from high school, whether he or she received matriculation certificate, whether this was a certificate that meets university requirements, or did it have enough, enough units that was enough for universities to get admitted to universities, and what was the average score in all these exams that they were taking. And then what we do is we link them to what happened with them after high school. So did they, we link the files with administrative records on post-high school schooling outcomes, and kind of look at whether they enrolled to higher education, how many years of post-secondary schooling did they complete, what type of schools did they enroll? Did they enroll to a university, or to an academic, or to a teacher college, or to like other academic colleges, and so kind of trace them and see what happens with them over time, and whether this reform that they had during high school, that the returns to education increased suddenly, change kind of the course of their education. That's basically what we are trying to do. And so this setting has a couple of kind of desirable properties from a research point of view, because students in kibbutzim that reformed early and those who reformed late appear quite similar in whatever it is that we can see about them. So here is what we see about them. Sorry, this is let's see if the link works. So these are just students, just students, various students' characteristics that we have. And we know the gender, the parents' years of schooling, how many kids they had, what's their original ethnicity, are they immigrants or not? And then we kind of look at are students in kibbutzim that reformed later really similar to kibbutzim that reformed later before any reform occurred? Because maybe they are totally different to begin with, and it's really hard to compare that. And what we find is across the board, we find that they look very similar. So students, maybe just given the time, maybe I will not go much to the details, but the students in kibbutzim that reformed early are similar in what we can observe, both in terms of their background and in terms of how they did in school before any reform started. It's not just that they are similar, because sometimes in research we worry that, yeah, maybe they look similar just a second before the reform, but maybe they were already on a different trajectory. You know, there was like a school kind of was on the rise in those who reformed early, but on the decline in the others. And what you see is just a continuation of that trend. So what we want to do is we want to look at the trend in you know, like, did they look very different, not just in the time, a second before the reform, but were they on a different time trends? And we find that they were not. They look very similar. They were on a very similar trajectory. They experienced small, you know, exit rates. So, you know, in whatever things that we can measure, and these things are never perfect, but in whatever things we can measure, students in kibbutzim that reformed early and those who reformed late look very, very similar before the reform occurs. Okay? And that's desirable for research because we may be able to attribute more to the reform than if we just, if that was not the case. And so, what we find, and that's kind of what I want to talk about, is we find that high school students' achievement increased substantially. Overall, even if we just look at the average student, the high school achievements increased substantially once the kibbutz reformed. So so basically what it did was, you know, maybe I'll just show the eventual number. So it increased. You know, the treatment effect was, you know, it was 3.3 point high, you know, students from kibbutzim that reformed early were 3.3% more likely to graduate after the reform. They got higher grades, you know, from an average of 70 to about 74, higher grades. They were 5% more likely to receive a matriculation certificate, from an average of about 55%, so from 55 to 60%, matriculation rates increased, and they were 6 percentage points more likely to receive a qualified matriculation certificate that qualified them for university. Okay, but what's more interesting to us was that. So yes, this is like so these are large effects. How do I know that they are large? When I compare them to what are the effects of other programs in Israel that are designed to increase grades. Like here is a remedial program to, you know, like increase grades of poorly achieving kids. We bring a private tutor for a year, you know, to sit with students a couple of hours every day. The effect of such a program was kind of roughly equivalent to the effect of how much students took school more seriously when you know, after this reform in the kibbutz. And notice that nothing happens during high school in this reform that the kibbutzim implemented. It's not like I give you money if you get better grades. It's just a perception that in, you know, over your lifetime, after you graduate, you will be doing better if you have more education. But one of the interesting things was the effect was substantially stronger in kibbutzim that you know, like I will skip some just to you know, to get to the interesting points. But the effect is mainly driven by students whose parents have low levels of schooling. So students whose parents are more educated, these guys were taking school seriously, even in the absence of any monetary returns to do so. So even in a world where a high school dropout and a computer science engineer would be getting paid the same, students whose parents are more educated, you know, work just as hard in high school. They got similar, you know, so the reform didn't affect them much at all. But students whose parents were less educated, they start to take school much more seriously once they have more incentives to do so. So they start now to get better grades, they are more likely to graduate, they are more likely to receive a matriculation certificate. Later we will see they are more likely to go to universities. Most of the effect of the returns to education here was on students from you know, less educated background. Now that is in itself is not a universal finding. So for example, in the context of a developing country, you know, there is a fascinating research by Rob Jensen, who basically look at in the Dominican Republic, using an experiment that we will not have time to elaborate on, he finds that it's mostly the students from the more educated background that tend to respond more when the returns to education increase. The difference makes some sense because the Dominican Republic is a more developing country. Israel is a more developed country. Perhaps financial constraints. So financial constraints must be more important in the Dominican Republic than they are in Israel. And so maybe in a context where you actually are financially constrained, you just don't have enough money, if you are from a more educated background, your parents are more able to help you once the incentives to study increase, you can get more help. And this is why maybe in the context of the Dominican Republic, the returns to education, it's mainly the more advantaged students from more advantaged background that benefited. In the context of the kibbutz, this is education. It's not so expensive. It's a developed country in general. Maybe there what we see is more that the returns are higher for the less advantaged students, and that effect is kind of stronger than the financial, than the kind of I don't have money effect. So that's kind of just it's a difference that we think is telling about what why they responded in a certain way. Interestingly, we find that a lot of the effect is larger for males than it is for females, and that's surprising because in a lot of the economics of education, a lot of the intervention that happened during high school, girls tend to be more responsive to incentives during high school. So you give a bonus if they get a better grade, you do this. Girls tend to respond more to incentives. Or at least that's what much of the research in the economics of education find. Here, notice again, nothing changes during high school. It's just the perception of what education will buy you later in the future. So if, females, for example, if girls think that, the returns to education for them is not as high, or maybe they think that, they think that they will have a smaller share of the overall household income and it's more important what the husband will earn, then that could rationalize why why it's the boys that took school more seriously when they had more incentive, when the returns to education increase. I could show you also that this, and it's not just during high school. They are then later more likely to enroll to teachers' colleges and to academic colleges. And so this change in the returns to education had an effect not just in high school, but also later on. And I think instead, I hate to finish late. So basically, I like to finish on time, respect people's time. And so maybe instead of just showing you some of the implications and conclusions of this, I will kind of point out that perhaps a bigger puzzle, so sure, when the returns to education increase, students take school more seriously. But perhaps the bigger puzzle is that kibbutz members were not less educated overall, even in a period where it was all the kibbutzim were based on full equal sharing. They were not less educated even then relative to the Jewish population in Israel. And you would think if returns to education matter so much, then how can you explain that the kibbutz members, where the returns to education were not important, people still are equally educated? So when I say they are equally educated, they are equally, so the blue bar is, the red bar is kibbutz, and the blue bar is Jewish population, Ashkenazi Jewish population, similar, people from similar ethnicity, outside the kibbutz. And you see kibbutz members are not less likely to graduate from high school. They don't get on average lower grades. They are equally likely to receive matriculation certificates. I can show you some other differences, but this is kind of, I would say, maybe more of the same. If I look at it historically, it's not the case that kibbutz members were less educated, in 1960, 1970, 1980. They are, and so to me, this suggests that, non-monetary reasons of acquiring education play a large role. It's not all about, you don't just go to high school and you do well there and you try to, just in order for to get returns in monetary terms. Sure, this is an important margin, and you can see that when the returns to education increase, people take school more seriously, but it's not the only thing. There are other reasons why, why people acquire education that has not much to do with the monetary returns. And just to finish on the, and say that this is to motivate my bigger research on the kibbutz, and perhaps if there is enough interest I can give a talk on it next year, is that it's actually part of a bigger puzzle even to me, of like how did these socialist islands of the kibbutzim survive in a capitalist world, and that's related to the discussion we had here about inequality. How did these egalitarian principles survive for almost a century in a capitalist world where there is plenty of incentive for free riding and shirking and not working very hard, and all these things that we blame socialism to have, like the best people might exit, and the adverse selection, that attract the worst people and so on. And so that's basically what I've devoting a good part of the last decade, and I'm now writing a book basically with approximately that the title, so maybe I can maybe talk about this more. But thank you very much.